Okay, I bet you thought you were going to get away with not listening to me today, but I have brought to you stock control through the wonders of technology. What I want you to do is listen to this, make a few notes. There is an activity built into this PowerPoint which you will have to pause the video and do or complete at the end. And then we'll go through all of this just to make sure you're fine with operations management next week. Okay, so stock control. What is stock in a business then? Well, there are essentially three types of stock: raw materials, work in progress, and finished goods. Now, if we put this in the context of your business that you were doing before Christmas, your raw materials are the raw materials. So for you, it would have been the actual wooden decorations, the paint, the glue, and everything else like that. The finished goods, again, easy to understand, are the finished items. So all of the finished decorations that you had done would be classified as finished goods. The work in progress is anything that's in between those two states. So in between being a raw material, but it's not yet a finished good. So it might have been a decoration that was half painted or that had been painted and not been decorated, but it would have been counted as work in progress. And it's important to recognise that certainly manufacturing businesses would have those three types of stock. Most retail businesses obviously only deal in finished goods. So, what influences the level of stock a business has? Now, what we're looking at here is how do we decide how much stock we have in our stock room and on our shelves? And obviously the biggest factor is the demand for the finished product. The more in demand it is, the chances are you're going to have more of it. What is secondary to that is also how easy it is to predict the demand for those goods. If it is a relatively easy product to predict, then you could possibly have lower stocks because you can anticipate when you're going to need it and when they're going to come in. The degree of spoilage and perishability, well, here we're talking about anything that's involving fresh. That could be fresh food, it could be fresh flowers, but it's obviously anything that is eventually going to go off. And again, you've got to manage your stock very, very carefully to make sure that what you bring in, you sell and don't have to waste. Rental costs. Now, you might not think of it as one of the obvious things, but if you have to rent your warehouse space, then that space needs to be used effectively. So again, you need to make sure you have the right level of stock in that warehouse at the right time. And it could be economies of scale. Now, we've talked about economies of scale, about buying in bulk and things like that. Again, if you can get that bulk buy discount, that may force you to have higher stock levels than perhaps what you are happy to have. Okay. And then the reliability of the suppliers. If you've got good suppliers, then you might be able to keep a relatively low level of stock because you know and can trust them to deliver on time should you start to run low. Whereas if you haven't got very good suppliers, then you may need to back up what you've got there and make sure you've always got some to hand. And finally, the amount of working capital available. Now, as we move towards the finance unit of work, we'll talk more about finance, but obviously, if you buy stock, you've got to have money available to do it. And if you don't have that ready cash, that working capital, you're going to find it very hard to buy stock. Okay, we've got more. The lead time. Now, this will become more important shortly because the lead time is how long it takes between you ordering the goods and them turning up for you to use. Now, if it's coming through the post, you might be talking 2 or 3 days. If it's coming by courier, it could be a day. If you're doing regular orders, it might be that they're delivered every week. And the lead time is what it takes between the order and it being delivered. And that becomes more important when we talk about stock control. Stockpiling. Again, it depends on your need for this, your space and everything else. This links into the other factors. But if you have the ability to stockpile, you may hoard a lot more stock than if you didn't. Opportunity cost. Again, we will talk about more costs nearer the time, but there is a cost, an opportunity cost to holding lots of stock. If you have lots of stock, then you don't have money to invest in other things, whether that's machinery, whether that's people, or anything else. So you've got to make sure that you're holding the right amount of stock so you're not tying up too much cash in the stock that you have. Seasonality, that is going to play a big part in certain businesses, and obviously it does what it says on the tin there. Seasonality is all to do with a product that has demand that is seasonal. So ice cream in the summer, or flip-flops in the summer, woolly gloves in the winter. So you might need to stockpile to anticipate heavy sales of gloves in October, November, December, January, and then in the summer you drive those stocks right down because you don't need to buy woolly gloves in June. The buffer stock, again, that's going to be more important when we look at our stock control charts shortly, but it's how much stock you're prepared to hold while you're waiting for things to be delivered. Now, if you have a very popular product, you probably do need a buffer stock because you don't want to sell out before your next delivery turns up. Where if it's a less popular product, the buffer stock might be lower. And there are lots of external factors, like we've had with everything we discuss. It could be the state of the economy, it could be consumers' incomes. All of those things will affect the amount of stock that you decide to hold. And of course, that goes back to that previous slide when we were talking about the ability to predict the demand. So, one of the key things you have to be able to do is to carry out stock control. Okay, now stock control is all about finding the economic order quantity, and this is the level of stock a business holds that minimizes its costs. So it's how much can we hold, but at the same time keep our costs low. So how can we meet the demand but keep the costs of holding that stock low? And it is calculated in the following trade-off. The more stock a business holds, the more expensive it is to keep, but the larger the size of stock reorder, the lower the cost. That's where the economies of scale kicks in. So if you're going to get a lower price for ordering 100 items, you might want to hold at 100 items. But, as the red sentence says, to hold 100 items would be expensive in terms of storage and insurance and everything else. So finding that right level is important. And one way to do that is to use this stock control chart. Now, what I have done is printed this out for you because you need to use it for some questions on the next slide. But if we just have a look at what we've got here at the moment, a stock control chart has this zigzaggy shape to it. And that's because we've got these certain things on here. We've got the stock going up the axis and the time going across the bottom. If we start at the very beginning, where it starts at 8, so there's 8,000 items in stock. Now, over the course of 2 months, if we look at the bottom here, it goes from 0 to 1 to 2. Over the course of 2 months, that they sell at a regular basis enough stock to take it from 8 down to 1.5. Okay. Now, 8 is the maximum stock level this business is prepared to hold. Now, that might be physically restrained by space. But they've also made a decision to have a minimum stock level or a buffer stock of 1.5. So what's got to happen is by the time we reach that 1.5, the next delivery of stock has to come in. Now for this business, they've calculated that if they reorder when it gets to 4,500 items of stock, which is approximately 1 month in, it will take another month for that order to be delivered, and by the end of month 2, it would have fallen to 1,500 items, and there will be enough stock delivered at the end of month 2 to take it back up to 8,000. And that pattern is repeated. The size of the order is the difference between the maximum and minimum stock levels. So it goes from 8 down to 1.5. So they have to order 6,500 items to bring that back up to 8. So hopefully you can take these definitions, the reorder level, the reorder quantity, the buffer stocks, and the lead time, and I want you to answer these questions. So what is the maximum number of units that the business can keep in stock? At what level of stock do they decide to order more? How long does it take to arrive? What is the reorder quantity? In a 2-month period, how much stock is used? and what are the limitations of a stock control diagram. Now you will have to think about that yourself. Okay, the second thing I want you to do is to try and draw a stock control chart yourself. So again, take this information, pause the video here now, get some graph paper, and you're going to produce a diagram like the one that was on the slide a couple of slides ago, but using these figures to draw it. Okay, and obviously I will have a look at that next lesson to see how things are going. So, when it comes to stock control, there are lots of other things that need to be considered. So, is the business using just-in-time to remove the buffer stock completely? We talked about just-in-time as one of these Japanese methods. It means the stock is delivered just in time for you to use it. So therefore, you don't use a buffer stock. In theory, you order that stock and it's delivered in time. If your suppliers are located close to the factory, then your reorder level will be less because you know you're going to get the items. And of course, the more reliable the supplier, the lower the lead time, the more likely they are to do favours for you and get things delivered the next day. So what happens if you get the stock levels wrong? Well, if we have too little stock, you can't meet demand. Production might need to stop if we're talking about raw materials. You might lose discounts because you can't buy in big orders, and you'll probably need lots more orders to bring that stock up to level. And we end up with what we call a stock out, i.e. you don't have the stock to sell to your customers. But of course, there is a position where you can have too much stock. So that causes storage costs. There is the opportunity cost that we talked about earlier of if you've invested in stock, you haven't got money to invest in something else. There is the administration of this stock, keeping track of it, making sure it's not being stolen, making sure it's insured. All of that costs money. There is the risk of obsolescence. It means it goes out of fashion or out of date, and therefore you're stuck with a load of stuff you can't use. And, of course, we have to come back to our employees. There is the risk, obviously, that employees could steal stuff that's just lying around. So remove the temptation. Okay, that's the end of the PowerPoint. If you need to, go back, rewatch it, turn the volume off if you can't be bothered to listen to me. But you need to make sure that you have interpreted the diagram, drawn your own, and then I've left a case study and an exam question about stock control, and it's from the specimen paper, so it's a proper exam question, and I've got a proper mark scheme for it. You should be able to get that done in the lesson, and I'd like you to leave it for me to mark so we can go through it straight away next lesson. Okay? If there are any problems, try and catch me on Friday. Otherwise, I will see you next week.